"You belong in the garage now," my husband said, not even looking up from his plate, as if he were commenting on the weather instead of deciding where I would sleep. I remember the way the fork felt in my hand, steady, even though something deep inside me shifted in a way I couldn't quite name at the time. I looked at him, then at the rest of the table, our son Daniel scrolling on his phone, his wife Claire sipping her wine like none of this concerned her, and I simply nodded. "All right," I said. That was all. No raised voice. No questions. Just that one word, quiet enough to disappear under the hum of the refrigerator. Dinner continued like nothing had happened. Plates clinked. Ice shifted in glasses. Someone asked about the weather tomorrow. I finished my meal, excused myself, and walked upstairs to the bedroom I had shared with Richard for over 40 years. I stood there for a moment, taking in the familiar details, the neatly folded quilt, the framed photo from our trip to Vermont, the faint scent of his aftershave still lingering in the air. Then I opened the closet and pulled out a single suitcase. Not the large one we used for vacations. Just the carry-on. I packed slowly. A few changes of clothes. My medications. The small wooden box I kept in the back of the drawer. The one Richard had never bothered to ask about. By the time I carried my things down to the garage, the house had gone quiet. The lights in the kitchen were off. The television murmured faintly in the living room. No one followed me. No one asked if I needed help. The garage smelled faintly of motor oil and old cardboard, the air cooler than the rest of the house. Richard's tools lined the walls in perfect order, each one hanging from its hook like it had a purpose. I set my suitcase down beside a stack of storage bins and looked around, taking in the space he had decided was good enough for me. It was almost funny, in a distant sort of way. After decades of keeping that house running, of remembering birthdays, paying bills, making sure everything was exactly where it needed to be, I had been reassigned like an item that no longer fit the room. I pulled an old folding chair closer to the small workbench and sat down, resting my hands in my lap. The silence settled around me, thick but not uncomfortable. Not anymore. Because the truth was, this didn't start tonight. It never does. It starts in the small things. The conversations that stop when you enter the room. The decisions made without your name attached. The subtle shift from being included to being tolerated. I had noticed it all. I just hadn't said anything. Not yet. I reached into my purse and took out my phone, scrolling through a set of documents I had reviewed earlier that week. Numbers, signatures, dates, details that most people would have overlooked. But I didn't. I never have. I stared at the screen for a moment, then locked it and set the phone down beside me. Upstairs, I heard a faint burst of laughter from the television, followed by Richard's voice, relaxed, unconcerned. He thought this was over. That a sentence spoken across a dinner table was the end of something. I leaned back slightly in the chair, letting out a slow breath. The concrete floor beneath my feet was cold, but it grounded me in a way the house upstairs no longer could. I wasn't angry. Not in the way people expect. There were no tears, no shaking hands, no desperate need to be heard. Just clarity. Clean and sharp. The kind that comes when you finally see something exactly as it is, without the softness of hope blurring the edges. I glanced once more around the garage, then at the closed door leading back into the house. They believed I had been put in my place, that I would adjust, that I would shrink. I folded my hands together and allowed myself the smallest hint of a smile. Because the only reason I had agreed to come down here was so they wouldn't see what I was about to do next. I did not sleep that night, but not because the garage was uncomfortable. It was because my mind had finally stopped making excuses for what I had been seeing for months, maybe even years, and once you stop explaining things away, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. I sat there watching the faint light from the small window shift as the hours passed, and I began to replay everything in a way I had not allowed myself to before. The conversations that ended when I entered the room, the financial statements that arrived already opened, the quiet decisions made without ever asking for my opinion. At first I had told myself it was just a phase, that Richard was stressed, that Daniel was busy building his career, that Claire simply had a different way of doing things. But patterns have a way of revealing themselves when you look at them long enough. And this one had been forming right in front of me. I thought about the afternoon 3 weeks earlier when I had walked into Richard's home office and found him quickly closing a folder. He had smiled, too quickly, and said it was just insurance paperwork, nothing I needed to worry about. I had nodded then too, just like I had at dinner, But later that evening, I noticed the envelope in the trash, a corner of it sticking out just enough for me to see the header. It was not insurance. It was a property document, and my name was not on the visible portion. That was the moment something inside me had started paying closer attention, not reacting, just observing. I remembered the call I received from the bank last week, a polite voice asking to confirm a change to one of our joint accounts. I had thanked them and said I would review it in person, and when I hung up, I did not confront Richard. I drove to the branch instead, sat down across from a young man in a navy suit, and asked him to show me everything connected to my name. He hesitated at first, then turned the screen toward me, and what I saw was not dramatic, not shocking in the way people expect. It was quiet, methodical, a series of small adjustments, transfers, and authorizations that slowly shifted control from shared to singular, from ours to his. And then I noticed the dates. Most of them lined up with times when I had been out of the house, volunteering, visiting friends, doing the very things that had once defined me as the center of our family. I did not raise my voice in that office. I did not accuse anyone. I simply asked for copies, printed and signed, and placed them neatly into a folder, the same folder now resting inside the wooden box in my suitcase beside me. I leaned forward slightly in the folding chair and pressed my hands together, feeling the weight of what I knew settle into something solid, something useful. Upstairs, a door closed, footsteps moved across the floor, life continuing as if nothing had shifted, but everything had. I was no longer trying to understand their intentions. I already did. This was not sudden. It was planned, careful, and patient, and that meant one thing. They believed they had time. They believed I would not notice. Until it was too late. I let out a slow breath and looked down at my hands, steady, calm, capable. For years I had been the one holding everything together, making sure the bills were paid, the schedules aligned, the family stayed connected, and they had mistaken that for weakness, for dependence, for something they could quietly remove without consequence. I reached into my purse again and took out my phone. Opening the email I had drafted but not yet sent, the address at the top was one I had not used in a long time. Margaret Lewis. I read the message once more, simple, direct, asking for a meeting first thing in the morning. Then I pressed send, the screen dimmed, and I set the phone down. The garage was still, almost peaceful, and for the first time in a long while, I was not reacting to what they had done. I was preparing for what I was about to do next. I arrived at Margaret Lewis's office at 8:15 the next morning, 10 minutes early, just like I always had been for every appointment in my life. The building itself was quiet, polished marble floors, soft lighting, the kind of place where everything appeared stable and permanent, and I suppose that was fitting considering what I had come to discuss. Margaret greeted me with the same measured warmth I remembered, her silver hair neatly styled, her posture straight, her eyes sharp in a way that told me she missed very little. She did not waste time with small talk. She never had. Instead, she gestured for me to sit and said my name once, gently, as if inviting me to begin. I placed the folder from my wooden box on her desk and opened it, sliding the documents toward her in a neat stack. She read in silence, page after page, her expression barely shifting. But I noticed the slight pause when she reached the bank transfers, the property forms, the signatures that did not include mine. When she finally looked up at me, there was no surprise in her face, only confirmation, as if everything she had suspected was now sitting plainly in front of her. I did not explain everything at once. I did not need to. I simply told her the facts as I had observed them, the quiet changes, the account adjustments, the way decisions had been made without my knowledge. Margaret listened without interrupting, occasionally making a small note, occasionally asking a question that cut directly to the heart of the matter, not emotional, not dramatic, just precise. When I finished, she leaned back slightly in her chair and folded her hands. "They are preparing to isolate you financially," she said, her voice calm, steady, like she was describing a process rather than a betrayal. I nodded once, because that was exactly what it felt like, a process, something that had been unfolding step by step while I continued living inside the illusion of partnership. Margaret turned the documents back toward me and tapped lightly on one page. "This," she said, "is where they assumed you would not look closely." I followed her finger. The date, the authorization, the shift in control. It was subtle, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. and I did now. Do they know that you know? She asked. And I shook my head. No, I said, and I would prefer to keep it that way. She studied me for a moment longer, as if weighing something unspoken, then gave a small nod, not approval, not surprise, just understanding. Then you have an advantage, she said, but only if you act before they complete what they have started. The room felt very still then, not tense, not overwhelming, just clear, like everything had finally been laid out in a way that made sense. Margaret began outlining options, legal steps, protective measures, each one explained in simple terms, no unnecessary language, no dramatics, just what could be done and what it would mean. I listened carefully, asking questions when needed, making sure I understood every detail, because this was not a moment for assumptions. This was a moment for precision. When she finished, she placed her pen down and looked at me directly. You have more control than they think, she said, but you need to decide how you want this to end. I held her gaze for a moment, then glanced down at the documents spread across the desk, the evidence of a plan that had been built quietly around me. I felt no panic, no urgency in the way people might expect, only a steady awareness of what needed to be done. I gathered the papers back into the folder, aligning the edges carefully, the same way I had done countless times before, and stood up. Margaret rose with me, walking me to the door. Call me when you are ready, she said, and I gave a small nod, stepping out into the hallway. The building felt different now, not because it had changed, but because I had. Outside, the morning air was cool, the sky clear, the kind of day that suggested everything was normal, but nothing was. I got into my car and sat there for a moment, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. I was not thinking about what Richard had said the night before, or where I had slept. Those details felt smaller now, almost irrelevant compared to what I understood. This was never about the garage. It was about control, and for the first time in a long while, I knew exactly where mine still existed. I started the engine, not to go back and confront anyone, not yet, but to return quietly, exactly as they expected. Because the most important part of any plan is making sure the other side believes they are still ahead. And as I pulled out onto the street, I allowed myself one brief thought. They had already decided where I belonged. They just did not realize yet that I was the one about to decide where they would end up. I returned home just before noon, pulling into the driveway with the same steady pace I had used every day for years. Nothing rushed, nothing out of place. The house looked exactly as it always had. White siding, trimmed hedges, the front porch swept clean, a picture of order and stability that would have convinced anyone passing by that everything inside was exactly as it should be. I stepped out of the car and paused for a moment. Not out of hesitation, but to take in the quiet, the kind of quiet that used to feel comforting and now simply felt revealing. When I opened the front door, I could hear voices from the kitchen, low but casual, the kind of conversation people have when they are not worried about being overheard. I set my keys down gently on the entry table, making no unnecessary noise, and walked in. Claire was standing by the counter, her phone in one hand, her tone light as she spoke. It is already moving forward. He said it would not take long. She glanced up when she saw me, her expression shifting just slightly before settling back into something polite, practiced. Oh, you are back early, she said. As if I had interrupted something unimportant, I gave a small nod and walked past her, placing my purse on the chair. I had an appointment, I said simply, no explanation offered, no details given. She smiled, thin and controlled. That is nice, she replied. And for a moment we stood there in the same space, two people who understood far more than either of us was willing to say out loud. Daniel entered a few seconds later, his tie loosened, his sleeves rolled up. He looked from Claire to me, then back again, his expression unreadable but not unaware. Everything okay? He asked, and I could hear the careful neutrality in his voice, the kind that avoids taking a side while still observing the outcome. Everything is fine, I said, meeting his gaze just long enough to let the words settle, not as reassurance, but as a statement. He nodded once, accepting it without question, or perhaps choosing not to question it. Richard was not in the room, but I could hear the faint sound of the television from the living room, a familiar background noise that suddenly felt distant, almost irrelevant. I moved through the kitchen as I always had, opening the refrigerator, checking what was inside, straightening a container that did not need straightening. Small actions that once defined my place in this house now performed with a different awareness. Claire resumed her conversation on the phone, stepping slightly away, her voice lowered again, but I had already heard enough. Not the exact words, but the direction, the confidence, the assumption that whatever they had set in motion was already beyond interruption. I closed the refrigerator door and leaned lightly against the counter, watching the reflection in the stainless steel surface, my own face looking back at me, calm, composed, unchanged on the outside. And that was exactly what I needed it to be. Daniel picked up his keys from the table. "I have to head back to the office," he said, his tone casual, but his eyes lingered on me for a fraction longer than necessary, as if he were trying to read something he could not quite define. "Drive safe," I replied, the same words I had said to him countless times. Before, he hesitated for just a second, then nodded and walked out, the door closing softly behind him. Claire ended her call and set her phone down, turning to me with that same composed expression. "Do you need anything?" she asked, the question sounding polite, but carrying no real intent behind it. I shook my head once. "No," I said, and for a moment the room was quiet again. The kind of quiet that holds more meaning than conversation ever could. I turned and walked toward the hallway, leading to the garage, not because I had to, but because it was expected, because they were watching, even when they pretended not to be. As I reached the door, I placed my hand on the handle and paused for just a second, not long enough to draw attention, just long enough to feel the weight of the moment settle into something clear and deliberate. Then I opened it and stepped through, closing it gently behind me. The air in the garage was the same as it had been that morning, cool, still, unchanged. I set my purse down on the workbench and reached for the wooden box, opening it with steady hands. Inside, the documents rested exactly where I had left them, organized, complete, undeniable. I ran my fingers lightly along the edge of the folder, not out of hesitation, but out of certainty. Upstairs, they believed everything was continuing as planned, that I had accepted my place, that I would remain exactly where they had put me. I closed the box and sat down in the folding chair. Once more, the same position, the same stillness, but not the same understanding, because now every step I took, every word I chose not to say, every moment I allowed to pass without reaction, was no longer about enduring what they were doing. It was about letting them believe they had already won, and that belief, more than anything else, was going to be their mistake. The next morning began like any other, which was exactly how I needed it to be. I woke before sunrise, the garage still dim and quiet, and folded the blanket I had used with the same care I once gave to every corner of the house. Nothing rushed, nothing careless, because even now, especially now, details mattered. I washed up in the small utility sink, the cold water sharp against my hands, grounding me, reminding me that discomfort was temporary but clarity was not. When I stepped back into the kitchen, the smell of coffee had already filled the space. Claire stood at the counter, her back straight, movements precise. She glanced over her shoulder as I entered, her eyes scanning me briefly before returning to her cup. "You are up early," she said, her tone neutral. I nodded once and moved past her, reaching for a mug. "I always am," I replied, and for a moment we existed in the same rhythm, quiet, measured, as if nothing had changed. Richard walked in shortly after, adjusting his watch, his expression unreadable but relaxed, the kind of ease that comes from believing everything is under control. He did not mention the night before, not directly. Instead, he poured himself coffee and said, "We should talk later about the house." As if it were a simple matter, a routine discussion. I met his gaze briefly, just enough to acknowledge the words. "Of course," I said, and turned back to the counter, not avoiding, not confronting, simply placing the conversation exactly where I wanted it. Later, Daniel joined us, his movements slightly quicker, his attention divided between his phone and the room. He glanced at me, then at Richard, and something passed between them, not spoken, but understood, a shared confidence, a timeline perhaps. I took a sip of coffee and let the silence stretch, not uncomfortable, just long enough for them to fill it if they chose, but they did not. And that told me everything I needed to know. After breakfast, the house settled into its usual pattern. Richard retreated to his office. Daniel left for work. Claire moved through the kitchen with quiet efficiency, and I returned to the garage, not because I had nowhere else to be, but because it was part of the role I was allowing them to see. Once inside, I closed the door gently and walked to the workbench. Opening the wooden box once more, the documents inside were no longer just information. They were timing, sequence, leverage. I took out my phone and checked for a response. Margaret had replied, short and direct, confirming our next steps. Requesting one additional document I knew exactly where to find. I placed the phone down and considered the house above me. Every room, every drawer, every file I had organized over decades. Nothing in that house existed without passing through my hands at some point. And that was something they had forgotten, or perhaps never fully understood. I stood up and moved to the small set of shelves along the wall, reaching behind a stack of old storage bins to retrieve a thin envelope I had placed there months ago, not because I expected to need it, but because I had learned long ago that preparation is quiet, invisible until it is not. I opened the envelope and slid out the document, reading over the details once more, the signatures, the clauses, the provisions that had been set in place years earlier. Back when Richard and I still spoke about the future as something shared, I allowed myself a brief pause, not out of nostalgia, but to recognize the difference between what was intended and what had become. Then I folded the paper carefully and placed it into the folder with the others. Upstairs, I could hear movement again. Footsteps crossing the floor, a door opening, the normal sounds of a house continuing its routine. Unaware that the foundation beneath it was already shifting, I closed the wooden box and rested my hand on top of it for a moment, steady, certain, because this was no longer about reacting to what they were doing. It was about completing what they had already started, just not in the way they expected. I picked up my phone again and dialed the number. Margaret had left at the bottom of her message. When she answered, I spoke clearly, calmly, giving her exactly what she needed, nothing more, nothing less. And when I ended the call, I set the phone down and looked around the garage one more time. The same space they had chosen. For me, the same place they believed defined my position now. I sat back down in the folding chair, my posture relaxed, my hands still, and allowed the quiet to settle again. Because the most important part of what came next was not speed, it was precision, and they had already given me everything I needed to ensure that when the moment arrived, there would be nothing left for them to control but their own realization of what they had done. By the afternoon, the house had settled into a quiet rhythm again, the kind that once felt comforting but now simply felt predictable. And predictability, I had learned, was something that could be used. I moved through the room slowly, not searching, not hesitating, just observing, taking in details the way I always had. The position of a folder on Richard's desk, the way Claire had started keeping her phone face down when I entered a room, the slight tension in Daniel's voice when he spoke to his father. These were not new things, they had been there for a while. I had simply chosen not to assign them meaning until now. I paused outside Richard's office door, which was slightly ajar, and from where I stood, I could see him at his desk, paper spread out in front of him, his pen moving with the same deliberate strokes I had seen for decades, signing, reviewing, confirming. I did not step in, I did not interrupt. Instead, I continued walking, letting the moment pass exactly as it would have if nothing had changed, because for them, nothing had. Later, I returned to the garage and closed the door behind me. The quiet there felt different now, less like exile and more like distance, and distance gave perspective. I placed the folder on the workbench and opened it again, this time arranging the documents in a different order, not by when I found them, but by how they connected. The bank transfers leading into the property adjustments aligning with the changes in authorization, each piece forming a sequence that was clear once you stepped back far enough to see it. I reached for a pen and made a few notes in the margin, small, precise, marking the points where everything shifted, not for memory, but for clarity, because when the time came, there would be no room for confusion. My phone vibrated lightly against the wood, a message from Margaret, confirming that everything I had provided was sufficient, that the next step could be initiated as soon as I gave the word. I read the message twice, not because I needed to, but because I understood the weight behind it. Once something like this begins, it does not pause. It moves forward, steady and exact. I set the phone down and leaned back slightly, letting my eyes rest on the ceiling, the faint hum of the house above filtering through, footsteps, a cabinet closing, the low murmur of voices, all of it continuing without awareness of what was already in motion beneath them. I thought about the years I had spent maintaining that house, not just physically, but quietly, making sure everything functioned, that nothing fell apart, and how easily that effort had been overlooked, reduced to something assumed, something replaceable. I sat up again and closed the folder, placing it carefully back into the wooden box. Then I reached for my purse and took out a small set of keys, not the ones I used every day, but the ones I had kept tucked away, attached to accounts and spaces that had not been part of our shared routine for some time. I turned one of them slowly between my fingers, feeling its weight, its purpose, and then I stood, moving toward the door that led back into the house. I did not open it immediately. Instead, I paused, listening, not for words, but for certainty, the certainty that they were still where they believed themselves to be, comfortable, unchallenged, confident in a plan that had yet to meet resistance. And when I was satisfied, I opened the door and stepped through, my expression unchanged, my movements calm, exactly as they had come to expect. Because the truth is, the moment you reveal your awareness, you lose your advantage, and I had no intention of doing that. Not yet. I walked through the hallway, past the living room where Richard sat watching television, his attention fixed on the screen, unaware of me passing behind him, and into the kitchen where Claire stood by the sink, her posture stiffening slightly as I entered. She glanced at me briefly, then returned to what she was doing, neither of us speaking, neither of us needing to. I reached for a glass of water, filled it slowly, and took a sip, letting the silence stretch just long enough to settle into something deliberate, something controlled. Then I set the glass down and turned away, because everything I did now, every step, every pause, every quiet moment, was no longer just part of a routine. It was part of a sequence, and they were still moving through it without realizing that the outcome had already begun to change. That evening, everything moved exactly as it always had, and that was the most important part. Richard sat at the head of the table, Daniel across from him, Claire to his right, and I took my place without hesitation, not because I belonged there in the way I once did, but because they expected me to act as if I did. Dinner was served, plates passed, small conversations exchanged, the surface of normality carefully maintained. Richard spoke about a meeting he had earlier. Daniel nodded along. Claire added a comment about a contractor they had been considering, and I listened, not because I was interested, but because I was measuring tone, timing, confidence, the subtle ease in their voices that came from believing nothing had changed. At one point, Richard glanced at me and said, "We will need to finalize some paperwork soon." His voice casual, almost dismissive, as if informing me rather than involving me. I looked at him, held his gaze just long enough, and gave a small nod. "Of course," I replied, the same answer I had given that morning, steady, neutral, giving nothing away. Claire's eyes flicked toward me for a brief second, searching, calculating, but I kept my expression exactly as it had been, composed, unreadable, because uncertainty on their side was more valuable than any reaction I could offer. After dinner, the dishes were cleared in silence. I moved through the motions automatically, rinsing, stacking, placing everything where it belonged, the same routine I had followed for years, and yet now every action felt deliberate, observed, part of a larger pattern they did not yet see. When everything was put away, Richard stood and adjusted his jacket. "We will talk tomorrow," he said, not asking, simply stating, and I inclined my head slightly. "Tomorrow is fine," I answered, matching his tone exactly. "Nothing more, nothing less." He paused for a fraction of a second, as if expecting something else, perhaps resistance, perhaps emotion, but when it did not come, he turned and walked out of the room. Daniel followed shortly after, his steps slower, his eyes lingering on me again, that same unreadable expression, caught somewhere between awareness and denial. Claire remained behind for a moment, wiping down the counter, her movements precise, controlled. She finally looked up at me and said, "You are handling this well." Her voice soft, almost complimentary, but there was something underneath it, something probing. I met her gaze, calm, steady, and said, "There is nothing to handle. and for the first time, I saw a slight hesitation in her expression, just enough to confirm that she was no longer entirely certain of the role she believed I was playing. I turned away then, not giving her the chance to press further, and walked toward the hallway, my steps unhurried, my posture unchanged. As I passed the living room, the television flickered quietly, casting shadows across the walls. Richard sat there again, his attention fixed forward, confident, settled, unaware that the foundation beneath that confidence had already begun to shift. I continued past without stopping and made my way back to the garage, closing the door behind me with the same gentle precision as before. The air inside was cool, still, unchanged, but I was not. I walked to the workbench and placed my hands on its surface, grounding myself for a moment, not because I needed strength, but because I needed clarity. I opened the wooden box and took out the folder, flipping to the final set of documents Margaret had prepared, the ones that would not just respond to what they had done, but redefine it entirely. I read through them once more, each line precise, each clause deliberate, leaving no space for interpretation, no room for reversal. When I finished, I closed the folder and placed it back inside, then reached for my phone, the screen lighting up in the dim space. I did not hesitate this time. I opened Margaret's message and typed a single response, clear, direct, exactly as required. And when I pressed send, I set the phone down and exhaled slowly, not out of relief, but out of completion. Upstairs, life continued. Voices, footsteps, the familiar sounds of a house that believed itself to be in control. But that belief was already outdated. I sat down in the folding chair once more, my hands resting calmly in my lap, my posture relaxed, because everything that needed to begin had already begun, and the only thing left now was time, not for them to act, but for them to realize that they no longer could. The next morning arrived with a stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if the house itself was holding its breath without understanding why. I stepped inside from the garage just as the sun began to filter through the kitchen windows, casting long, quiet shadows across the floor. Everything appeared unchanged. The same table, the same chairs, the same carefully arranged space that had once felt like the center of my life. But there was a difference now, not in the room, but in the weight of what was about to unfold within it. Richard was already seated, a cup of coffee in front of him, a stack of papers placed neatly beside his hand. Daniel stood near the counter, his phone in his hand, but his attention clearly elsewhere. Claire leaned against the edge of the counter, her posture composed but her eyes alert, watching, waiting. I walked in without hesitation and took my usual seat, not because I needed to, but because they expected me to, and expectation, I had learned, was a powerful thing when used correctly. Richard looked up at me, his expression calm, controlled. "We should go over everything now," he said, sliding the papers slightly forward, his tone suggesting that this was a formality, something already decided. I gave a small nod and folded my hands in front of me. "Of course," I replied, my voice steady. Giving nothing away, he began to explain, his words measured, structured, outlining changes to accounts, adjustments to ownership, the future of the house. Each sentence delivered as if it were reasonable, necessary, inevitable. Daniel listened quietly, his jaw slightly tense. Claire remained still, her gaze shifting between Richard and me, waiting for a reaction that did not come. When Richard finished, he placed a pen on top of the papers and pushed them toward me. "This will make things simpler," he said, and for a moment, the room settled into silence. The kind that invites a response. I looked down at the documents, not reading them, because I already knew what they contained. Then I looked back up at him, meeting his eyes with the same calm he had been using, and I reached into my purse, not for the pen, but for my own folder, placing it carefully on the table between us. The movement was quiet, deliberate, and for the first time, I saw something shift in his expression, not fear, not yet, but uncertainty, small, subtle, but unmistakable. I opened the folder and turned it toward him. The documents inside arranged with the same precision he had used, but with a very different outcome. "Before we finalize anything," I said, my voice even, controlled, "there are a few things you should review." The words hung in the air, not confrontational, not emotional, just clear. Richard frowned slightly, his hand moving toward the papers as if out of habit, but slower now, more cautious. Daniel stepped closer, his attention fully engaged. Claire straightened just slightly, her composure tightening. Richard began to read, his eyes moving across the page, his expression shifting with each line, not dramatically, but enough to show that what he was seeing did not match what he expected. The silence deepened. No one spoke. No one moved. The only sound was the faint rustle of paper as he turned the page. When he finally looked up, the confidence that had been there moments before was no longer as solid, replaced by something less certain, less controlled. I did not explain. I did not elaborate. I simply sat there, my hands folded, my posture unchanged, allowing the documents to speak for themselves, because that was the difference between what they had planned and what I had prepared. Theirs relied on assumption. Mine relied on certainty. Daniel glanced between us, his expression shifting from confusion to realization. Claire's eyes narrowed slightly, calculating, reassessing, and Richard, for the first time since this began, did not immediately speak. I leaned back slightly in my chair, not as a gesture of dominance, but of completion, because everything that needed to be said was already in front of them. And for the first time, the balance in the room had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but definitively, and the only thing left now was for them to understand exactly what that meant. Richard did not speak immediately, and that silence was louder than anything he had said the night before, his hand still resting on the edge of the papers. As if he had not yet decided whether to pull them closer or push them away, Daniel shifted beside him, his eyes moving quickly across the pages, his expression tightening as understanding settled in piece by piece. Claire remained still, but the confidence in her posture had changed, not gone, but recalculating, adjusting to a version of events she had not prepared for. I watched them without urgency, without satisfaction, simply observing the moment as it unfolded, because this was not about winning in the way they might have expected. It was about restoring something that had been quietly taken. Richard finally cleared his throat, a small, controlled sound, and looked at me with a different kind of focus, not dismissive, not casual, but careful. "What is this?" he asked, his voice measured, as if choosing each word with more caution than before. I met his gaze, steady, unchanged. "It is everything you assumed I would not see," I replied, my tone calm, not sharp, not defensive, just clear. He glanced back down at the documents, reading again, slower this time, more deliberate, as if hoping the meaning would shift if he gave it enough attention. But it did not. Daniel exhaled quietly, running a hand through his hair, the first visible sign of discomfort. "Dad," he said softly, not finishing the sentence, because there was nothing left to suggest. The facts were already there. Claire stepped closer to the table, her eyes narrowing slightly as she read over Richard's shoulder, her silence more telling than any reaction she might have offered. I remained where I was, my hands folded, my posture relaxed, because everything that needed to be done had already been done. This moment was simply the result of that. Richard set the papers down slowly, the movement controlled but heavier than before, and looked at me again, searching for something, an explanation, a weakness, a way to regain the position he believed he still held. But there was nothing there for him to use. "You went behind my back," he said finally, the words quieter now, less certain. I tilted my head slightly, considering the statement, not dismissing it, not accepting it, just placing it where it belonged. "No," I said, my voice even. I paid attention. The distinction settled between us, simple, undeniable. Daniel looked down at the table, his earlier confidence gone, replaced by something more uncertain, more aware. Claire straightened slowly, her expression composed again, but different now, less assured, more cautious. Richard leaned back in his chair, the tension in his shoulders visible, his control slipping not through confrontation, but through realization. I stood then, not abruptly, not dramatically, just rising in a way that felt natural, expected. I gathered my folder, closing it carefully, aligning the edges as I always had, and held it at my side. No rush, no hesitation. "There is nothing left to finalize," I said, not as a challenge, not as a declaration, but as a simple statement of fact. The room remained quiet. No one moved to stop me. No one argued, because there was nothing left to argue. I turned and walked toward the hallway, my steps steady, The same pace I had used for years, but with a different understanding behind each one. As I passed the living room, the television was still on, the same quiet flicker of light across the walls. Unchanged, just like everything else that had once seemed permanent. I continued to the door leading to the garage, opened it, and stepped through, the cool air meeting me again. Familiar now, not as a place I had been sent, but as a place I had chosen to use. I set the folder back into the wooden box and closed it, my hand resting on the lid for a moment, grounding, not because I needed strength, but because I recognized completion when it arrived. Upstairs, I could hear movement, voices lower. Now, less certain, the rhythm of the house disrupted in a way that could not be undone. I sat down in the folding chair one last time, my posture relaxed, my hands still, and allowed myself a small, quiet breath, not relief, not victory, just clarity. Because the truth is, they had never really understood what they were trying to take, and now, for the first time, they were beginning to see exactly what they had lost. And more importantly, what they would never have control over again.